Every time the Middle East edges closer to the brink, somebody profits, and increasingly that somebody isn't Washington. Here's what the mainstream financial press won't connect for you. Rising Gulf tensions don't just spike oil prices, they quietly redraw the map of who collects the windfall. Russia sits on some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves on the planet, and every dollar that gets added to the price of a barrel flows directly into Moscow's fiscal calculations. The United States has spent decades building a security architecture in the Gulf that was supposed to keep energy markets stable and dollar-denominated, but that architecture is cracking, visibly, structurally, and the fractures are serving interests that are not American. What we are watching right now is not random turbulence. It is a slow, deliberate shift in economic gravity, and if you are an American trying to understand why your world feels less predictable than it did 10 years ago, this is exactly where you need to be paying attention. Let's go back to basics for a moment, because the story here is one that most people intuitively feel but rarely get explained in plain language. The global oil market is not simply a marketplace where buyers and sellers meet and prices are set by supply and demand in any clean textbook sense. It is a geopolitical instrument. It has been one since at least the early 1970s, when the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger engineered what became known as the petrodollar system. The deal was straightforward in its architecture, even if breathtaking in its ambition. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states would price their oil exclusively in US dollars, and in return, Washington would provide them with military protection, political legitimacy, and access to American weapons and financial markets. Every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, would therefore need dollars. And needing dollars meant feeding demand for US Treasury bonds, which funded American deficits, which kept the whole machine running. That system has been the invisible foundation of American global power for more than 50 years, and it is now under serious, sustained pressure. Now here is where Russia enters the picture, and this is where the analysis gets genuinely important. Russia is the world's second or third largest oil producer depending on the month and the measurement, and it is also one of the largest natural gas exporters on the planet. For decades, Russia operated within the Western-dominated financial architecture, selling its hydrocarbons largely in dollars, keeping reserves in Western financial institutions, and playing by the rules of a system that was designed in Washington and enforced through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Then came 2022, and the sanctions regime that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the calculus entirely. Western nations froze roughly $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves held in European and American financial institutions. That single act, unprecedented in scale against a major power, sent a message to every government on Earth that was not firmly inside the Western alliance: your dollar reserves are not safe, they can be frozen, seized, weaponized, and that message landed with particular force in the Gulf. Think about what that means for a country like Saudi Arabia, which has historically been the anchor of the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia has been accumulating dollar reserves and US Treasury bonds for decades as part of its side of the bargain. But watching what happened to Russia's reserves in 2022 created what you might call a quiet but profound anxiety in Riyadh. If Washington could do that to Russia, could it do it to them? Under what circumstances? These are not paranoid questions, they are rational risk assessments by governments managing enormous sovereign wealth funds, and the answer, at least partly, has been to quietly diversify. Saudi Arabia has been deepening its economic ties with China, it has been conducting oil trades in yuan, it has been engaging with BRICS, the grouping that now includes, alongside Russia and China, major economies like India, Brazil, and several others. The architecture of the petrodollar system is not collapsing overnight, but it is being hedged against, and that hedging has consequences. Now let's talk about what Gulf tensions specifically do to this picture, because that's the heart of what we're examining here. When tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, whether it's Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, threats to the Strait of Hormuz, escalating rhetoric between Iran and its neighbors, or any number of other friction points that have become distressingly routine, the immediate market response is a spike in oil prices. That's the obvious part, and the financial media covers it dutifully. Brent crude goes up, gasoline prices at American pumps go up, headlines get written, but the secondary and tertiary effects are where the real geopolitical story lives. When oil prices spike, Russia's revenues go up. When Russia's revenues go up, its capacity to sustain military operations, fund its government and project power abroad increases. When Russia's capacity increases, the leverage that Western sanctions were supposed to create diminishes. The entire punitive logic of the sanctions regime rests on the assumption that you can squeeze Russian revenues enough to force a change in behavior. Gulf tensions, by spiking oil prices, directly undermine that assumption. And here is something that rarely gets said plainly in the mainstream coverage. Russia has a strategic interest in Gulf instability, not necessarily in direct military conflict, not in chaos that would destabilize global markets in ways that hurt Russia too, but in a persistent level of tension that keeps a risk premium baked into the price of oil. A world where the Gulf is perpetually simmering but not boiling is, from Moscow's perspective, close to optimal. It keeps oil prices elevated, it keeps Western attention divided, and it keeps the petrodollar system under stress without triggering the kind of full-scale crisis that might force a dramatic Western response. Russia doesn't need to start fires in the Gulf. It just needs to ensure that the fires that are already burning don't get extinguished too quickly. Now let's talk about Iran, because you cannot understand Gulf tensions without understanding Iran's role, and you cannot understand Iran's role without understanding its relationship with Russia. Iran and Russia are not natural allies in any deep historical or cultural sense. They have a complicated, often adversarial history stretching back centuries, but they are what you might call tactical partners, bound together by a shared interest in weakening American influence in the Middle East and in undermining the petrodollar architecture. Iran provides Russia with military drones that have been used extensively in Ukraine. Russia provides Iran with diplomatic cover at the United Nations Security Council, blocking resolutions that would tighten pressure on Tehran. Iran's capacity to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes, is one of the most potent geopolitical leverage points on the planet, and as long as Iran retains that capacity, every escalation in Gulf tensions carries an implicit threat to global oil supply that pushes prices higher and, by extension, benefits Moscow. The Houthi movement in Yemen is another piece of this puzzle that deserves serious attention. The Houthis, who are aligned with Iran, have been conducting attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea since late 2023, targeting vessels that they claim are linked to Israel or operating in support of Israel in the context of the Gaza conflict. These attacks have forced major shipping companies to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and significant cost to global supply chains. They have pushed up shipping insurance rates dramatically, and they have created yet another layer of instability in a region that was already carrying enormous geopolitical stress. Now, the Houthis are not Russian proxies in any direct sense, but the chaos they generate serves Russian interests indirectly by keeping the region destabilized, keeping oil prices elevated, and keeping the United States and its allies tied down in reactive mode rather than being able to project coordinated pressure on Moscow over Ukraine. Let's step back and think about the American position in all of this, because it is genuinely uncomfortable and it's important to look at it clearly. The United States has enormous military assets in the Gulf region. It has the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, it has significant forces in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. It has spent trillions of dollars over the past several decades between the Gulf War, the Iraq War, operations in Afghanistan and Syria, and the ongoing naval deployments, maintaining its position as the dominant external power in the region. And yet that enormous investment has not bought stability. It has bought a kind of managed instability, a situation where the United States is perpetually engaged, perpetually spending, and perpetually reactive to developments that it does not fully control. Meanwhile, the financial costs of that engagement fall on American taxpayers, the human costs fall on American service members and their families, and the strategic benefits are increasingly being captured by other players. China is perhaps the most striking example of this dynamic. China has become the largest importer of Gulf oil, surpassing the United States years ago as American domestic shale production reduced U.S. dependence on Middle Eastern crude. This means that the American military presence in the Gulf is, in substantial part, protecting oil supply lines that primarily serve China's economy. That is a remarkable strategic contradiction, and it is one that thoughtful analysts in Washington have been pointing out for years without any obvious resolution emerging. China benefits from American security guarantees in the Gulf while simultaneously building an alternative financial architecture through BRICS, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through yuan-denominated oil trades that is designed to reduce the centrality of the dollar in global energy markets. It is, from Beijing's perspective, an extraordinarily clever position to be in. Russia understands this dynamic perfectly. Russian strategic thinkers have been analyzing the contradictions of American Gulf policy for decades, and they have been patient. The Russian approach to geopolitical competition is not primarily about direct military confrontation. That is expensive, risky, and tends to produce unified Western responses. It is about exploiting existing fault lines, deepening existing contradictions, and positioning Russia to benefit from trends that it did not necessarily create but can certainly accelerate. The gradual erosion of the petrodollar system is one such trend. The growing frustration of Gulf states with Washington's reliability as a security partner is another. The rising economic weight of China and India as alternative markets for Gulf hydrocarbons is a third. Russia doesn't need to manage all of these trends, it just needs to not get in their way. There is something else worth examining here, which is the question of what rising Gulf tensions do to the American domestic political economy. When oil prices spike because of Gulf instability, American consumers pay more at the pump. That creates political pressure on whoever is in the White House. That political pressure typically translates into demands for diplomatic engagement, for negotiation, for some kind of de-escalation that brings prices back down. In other words, Gulf-driven oil price spikes create domestic American political incentives to reduce tension in ways that may not always align with the broader strategic interest of maintaining pressure on Iran, supporting partners in the region, or sustaining a coherent long-term policy. American politics operates on 2- and 4-year cycles. Geopolitical strategy operates on decades-long timescales. That mismatch is a structural vulnerability, and it is one that adversaries understand and exploit. Think about how this plays out concretely. Suppose Gulf tensions spike significantly, maybe a serious Houthi strike on a major oil facility, or an Iranian confrontation with US naval assets in the Strait of Hormuz. Oil goes to $120, $130 a barrel. Gasoline in the United States hits $5, $6 a gallon. The political uproar is immediate and enormous. The administration, whatever administration it is, faces massive pressure to do something to bring prices down. The options are limited. Release strategic petroleum reserves, which provides temporary relief but doesn't address the underlying tension. Engage in direct diplomacy with Iran, which means making concessions that the hardline elements of American foreign policy establishment resist, or escalate militarily, which carries enormous risks of regional war that nobody actually wants. In each of these scenarios, the initiative has been ceded to the forces creating the instability. Washington is reacting, and every day that Washington is reacting to Gulf tensions is a day that it is not projecting coherent strategic pressure on Moscow. This is not a coincidence. This is what strategic competition between major powers actually looks like in the modern era. It is not primarily about tank battles or missile exchanges, though those things happen. It is about the patient exploitation of structural vulnerabilities, the manipulation of economic dependencies, the creation of dilemmas that force opponents to choose between bad options. Russia and its partners in this informal axis of resistance to American hegemony, Iran being the most significant in the Gulf context, have identified the petrodollar system and the network of relationships and dependencies that sustains it as a central vulnerability of American global power. They are working methodically and with considerable sophistication to stress that system, and Gulf tensions are one of the primary instruments available to them. For ordinary Americans trying to make sense of why the world feels so much more complicated and unstable than it did a generation ago, this is part of the answer. The post-Cold War moment of American unipolar dominance, that roughly 15-year window between the fall of the Soviet Union and the financial crisis of 2008, created a widespread assumption that American-led globalization was the permanent condition of international affairs. That assumption is being dismantled, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of countless smaller shifts. Oil trades conducted in yuan, reserve managers quietly diversifying away from dollars, Gulf states hedging their relationships between Washington and Beijing, and the steady erosion of the credibility of American security guarantees that comes from every perceived failure of American policy in the region. The oil market is where all of these abstract geopolitical trends become concrete and measurable. Every barrel of oil priced above what it would be in a stable US-dominated world order represents a transfer of wealth and leverage away from the American-centered system and toward the countries and networks that are challenging it. Russia, as one of the world's great hydrocarbon exporters, is among the primary beneficiaries of that transfer. That is the cold structural reality that sits beneath the daily headlines about Gulf tensions, shipping disruptions, and oil price movements. It is not a comfortable reality for Americans to sit with, but it is an honest one, and understanding it clearly is the necessary first step toward thinking seriously about what, if anything, can be done about it.